York, this is Democracy Now!
Yes, I'm supporting Donald Trump. I'm doing so as enthusiastically as I can, given the fact I think he's a terrible human being. But the choice on the other side is just as bad.
Trump is a terrible human being. Those are the words of Mick Mulvaney, the man Trump has chosen to be his new chief of staff. We'll speak with former presidential candidate Ralph Nader about Mulvaney, the resignation of Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke, the possible Christmas government shutdown over the border wall, and the future of Obamacare after a conservative judge rules it to be unconstitutional. Plus, we'll speak with Ralph Nader about his new book, To the Ramparts, how Bush and Obama paved the way for the Trump presidency and why it isn't too late to reverse course.
There is huge conservative liberal support for a higher minimum wage. There's a lot of conservative support for full Medicare for all. They don't want their health care claims denied arbitrarily, et cetera. There's big support for corporate crime enforcement. There's big support for breaking up the big banks that are too big to fail. That comes in about 80–90%. And the Democrats could have woven this into an unstoppable political force.
Then from Arizona to Yemen, the journey of an American bomb. We'll look at how a bomb built by Raytheon in Tucson was used by Saudi Arabia to kill 31 Yemeni civilians. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Delegates from nearly 200 countries have agreed to a United Nations deal on climate change that seeks to keep global temperatures from rising by more than 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. The deal, brokered in a marathon session as 2 weeks of climate negotiations came to an end in Katowice, Poland on Saturday, sets a so-called rule book on how to implement the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement. Greenpeace Executive Director Jennifer Morgan welcomed the outcome as an important step. It said countries still have to do far more to prevent the worst effects of catastrophic climate catastrophe.
On this rule book, I think that is a solid outcome. Basically, what you now have is that all countries, the U.S., China, Europe, South Africa, etc., have accepted binding rules and common rules to report and review what they're doing. And that's important. But that doesn't substitute for the need to build ambition and to say, okay, we get it, we're going to go and increase our ambition, because it's really the very existence of islands and people that's at stake here. President
Trump's pledge to withdraw the U.S. from the Paris Climate Agreement. Democracy Now! Was at the UN talks in Katowice all last week. You can see our coverage archived at democracynow.org. President Trump's ordered Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke to step down by the end of the year. Zinke's resignation came amidst at least 17 federal investigations into his suspected ethics violations and corruption, including at least one Justice Department probe that could result in criminal charges. During his less than 2 years at the Interior Department, Zinke presided over the largest rollback of protections to federal land in U.S. history and opened up vast swaths of U.S. coastal waters to oil and gas drilling. Trump's expected to name Zinke's deputy, David Bernhardt, as acting Interior Secretary. Bernhardt is a former fossil fuel and water industry lobbyist who played a key role in weakening endangered species protections to allow for new oil and gas drilling in western states. President Trump has chosen White House Budget Director Mick Mulvaney as acting White House Chief of Staff to replace John Kelly, who's set to step down in January amidst friction with Trump and growing chaos in the White House. Mulvaney's promotion came as the Daily Beast website obtained a video recorded in 2016 of then Congressperson Mick Mulvaney calling Donald Trump a terrible human being.
Yes, I'm supporting Donald Trump. I'm doing so as enthusiastically as I can, given the fact I think he's a terrible human being. But the choice on the other side is just as bad.
Mulvaney also said Trump had said disgusting and indefensible things about women in a 2005 Access Hollywood tape and made similar comments on social media that he later deleted after he joined the Trump administration. In Texas, a federal courts declared the Affordable Care Act unconstitutional, setting up a likely challenge to President Obama's signature health care law at the Supreme Court. Federal District Court Judge Reed O'Connor, a George W. Bush nominee, ruled Friday that the ACA's individual health insurance mandate violates the Constitution, which invalidates the entire law, he said. Speaking at a congressional ball Saturday night, President Trump hailed the ruling.
I believe we're going to get really good health care. Exciting things happened over the last 24 hours.
The ruling is a victory for the 18 Republican state attorneys general and 2 Republican governors who are challenging the ACA, but the law will remain in effect as the ruling is appealed. White House senior advisor Stephen Miller said Sunday President Trump is prepared to shut down the government if Democrats don't provide billions of dollars to build an expanded wall on the U.S.-Mexico border. Miller was speaking with Margaret Brennan of CBS's Face the Nation.
We're going to do whatever is necessary to build the border wall to stop this ongoing crisis of illegal immigration.
And that means
this is a very, if it comes to it, absolutely. This is a very fundamental issue. At stake is the question of whether or not the United States remains a sovereign country.
A government shutdown could see more than 600,000 federal workers furloughed without pay just ahead of Christmas. This comes as the family of a 7-year-old indigenous Guatemalan girl who died on December 8th while in the custody of the U.S. Border Patrol demands answers. Jacqueline Calmaquin died of shock from sepsis after she and her father were detained in a remote part of New Mexico. Border Patrol agents only brought the girl to the hospital after her body temperature spiked to over 105 degrees. This is Ruben Garcia, an immigrant rights activist and director of the Annunciation House in El Paso, Texas.
The family is seeking an objective and thorough investigation and are asking that investigators will assess this incident within nationally recognized standards for the arrest and custody of children.
On Friday, the Inspector General of the Department of Homeland Security promised to investigate the death. This comes as new data shows the Trump administration continues to increase the number of arrests and deportations of immigrants. During the 2018 fiscal year that ended in September, the U.S. deported more than 250,000 people, a 13% increase over a year before. Even so, the pace of deportations in 2018 was only about half of the record pace set under President Obama. The president's former personal attorney and fixer, Michael Cohen, told ABC News Donald Trump directed him in 2016 to make illegal payments to 2 women who alleged they had sexual affairs with Trump. Cohen's interview with George Stephanopoulos was recorded one day after Cohen was sentenced to 3 years in prison for tax evasion, bank fraud, and lying to Congress, and after Cohen admitted he broke federal campaign finance laws by paying hush money to adult film star Stormy Daniels and former Playboy model Karen McDougal during the 2016 campaign.
He directed me to make the payments. He directed me to become involved in these matters, including the one with McDougal, which was really between him and David Pecker, and then David Pecker's counsel. I just reviewed the documents in order to protect him. I gave loyalty to someone who truthfully does not deserve loyalty.
He was trying to hide what you were doing, correct?
Correct.
And he knew it was wrong?
Of course.
President Trump lashed out at Cohen once again on Twitter Sunday, tweeting Michael Cohen only became a rat after the FBI broke into an attorney's office, unquote. The president's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, said Sunday Donald Trump pursued discussions about building a skyscraper in Moscow until November of 2016, far later than previously known. Giuliani told ABC's This Week that Trump made the admission in written responses he submitted to investigators with special counsel Robert Mueller's team. The admission directly contradicts President Trump's claim in 2017 that, quote, I have nothing to do with Russia, haven't made a phone call to Russia in years, unquote. In medical news, the U.S. pharmaceutical giant Johnson & Johnson knew for decades that some of its talcum powder contained dangerous levels of asbestos, but covered up its findings about the deadly carcinogen. That's according to an investigation by the Reuters news agency, which found documents showing the company knew about traces of asbestos in some of its baby powder as early as 1971. The news sent share prices of Johnson & Johnson plunging by 10% Friday. The report came as Johnson & Johnson faces thousands of lawsuits claiming its talcum powder led to cancer. President Trump tweeted Sunday he would review the case of Major Matt Goldstein, Green Beret, who's been charged with premeditated murder after Goldstein told the CIA in 2011 he killed an Afghan man he suspected of being a bomb maker in 2010. The military reprimanded him but did not press murder charges. But after Goldstein admitted to the killing in a 2016 interview on Fox News, the Army reopened an investigation and recently charged him with murder. On Sunday, President Trump tweeted, quote, "At the request of many, I will be reviewing the case of a U.S. military hero, Major Matt Goldstein," he tweeted. Legal experts say the president's tweet threatens to undermine an ongoing criminal prosecution. In Wisconsin, outgoing Republican Governor Scott Walker has signed legislation that limits the power of the incoming Democratic governor and attorney general-elect while rolling back early voting in future elections. Democrats have blasted the power grab as a legislative coup and say they'll sue to have the laws overturned. Wisconsin Senator Tammy Baldwin called the Republican move a craven partisan attack on democracy. And in Los Angeles, an estimated 50,000 teachers and other public school workers marched to City Hall Saturday demanding better pay and more resources for students in classrooms. United Teachers Los Angeles says its members are prepared to strike in January unless city officials meet their demands for smaller class sizes, more libraries, fewer standardized tests, and more teacher input in local school leadership councils. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. It's been another tumultuous week for the Trump administration as President Trump threatens to shut down the federal government over funding for a border wall. There have been some shakeups in the Trump White House. On Saturday, President Trump announced Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke will soon resign. Zinke's facing at least 17 federal investigations into suspected ethics violations. During his time in office, Zinke presided over the largest rollback of protections to federal land in U.S. history and opened up vast swaths of U.S. coastal waters to oil and gas drilling. Former fossil fuel industry lobbyist David Bernhardt will become the interim Interior Secretary. He's the deputy now. Meanwhile, Trump has tapped Mick Mulvaney to become acting chief of staff to replace General John Kelly. Mulvaney already holds 2 posts in the administration: White House Budget Director and acting director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Meanwhile, in Texas, a federal judge has declared the Affordable Care Act unconstitutional, setting up a likely challenge to President Obama's signature health care law at the Supreme Court. To talk about all of this and much more, we're joined by longtime consumer advocate and former presidential candidate Ralph Nader. He's author of the new book, To the Ramparts: How Bush and Obama Paved the Way for the Trump Presidency and Why It Isn't Too Late to Reverse Course. Ralph Nader, welcome back to Democracy Now! Let's start where we ended with that long list of just what's happened this week, and that is this Texas federal judge, yes, nominated by President George W. Bush, but confirmed by a Democratic Senate. This judge calling the ACA, calling Obamacare unconstitutional, and what this means.
I think it's going to be overturned. It's almost unanimously condemned by legal experts from all sides. It's a considered intellectually bad opinion by conservative legal scholars and denounced even more vociferously by progressive legal scholars. And it doesn't have an injunction in the country, so there's going to be no changes unless on rehearing, the judge really goes off the rails. But then I think he would be overreaching in terms of his own jurisdiction. So we'll wait for the Circuit Court of Appeals.
So the Circuit Court of Appeals rules, and then it could go to the Supreme Court right in time for the 2020 elections. President Trump tweeted this morning, the deductible which comes with Obamacare is so high it's practically not even usable, hurts families badly. We have a chance, working with the Democrats, to deliver great health care. A confirming Supreme Court decision will lead to great health care results for Americans, he wrote. So if you can respond to that and talk about an issue that's not talked about very much in the corporate media, and that is the issue of Medicare for all.
Well, that opens the door I mean, if Obamacare, which is full of loopholes, excessive complexity, still 29 million people without health insurance, tens of millions underinsured, the corporations run away with record profits, drug companies, hospital chains, insurance companies, huge executive compensation. So if they overturn judicially, which is not likely, Obamacare, even the Wall Street Journal has said that this will open up the path to single-payer, full Medicare for all, everybody in, nobody out, much more efficient, and above all, gives you your free choice of doctor and hospital. You're not corralled in these narrow networks. And if you go on a network, you have to really pay tremendous price out of your own pocket. So that's what we're waiting the Congress to do now. The congressional committees, with their fat budgets and staff under the Republicans, have been sitting on their hands. They haven't been engaging in public hearings, Amy. They haven't been engaging in supervising the corruption in the executive branch. And we're going to present to the progressive chairs of the House of Representatives a whole list of hearings that have to be held in order to put these in play electorally, in terms of public opinion, and in terms of civic action. I can give you a quick list if you'd like.
Go ahead.
Okay. First, obviously, is one on single payer. Full Medicare for all is now supported by a majority of the American people, a modest majority of doctors, even bigger majority of nurses. What are we waiting for here? It's much more efficient as well. There needs to be hearings on corporate crime by the Judiciary Committee. There's a corporate crime wave in this country. According to Malcolm Sparrow, Harvard University, and other sources, $350 billion in annual billing fraud and abuse in the healthcare industry. That's almost $1 billion a day. It isn't even mentioned under the Republicans in Congress. Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine put out a report, peer-reviewed, over 2 years ago. 5,000 people die every week in this country in hospitals due to preventable problems. We know what they are. There are no congressional hearings here. There's got to be congressional hearings on foreign policy. We don't have any reevaluation of failed foreign policy or the wars of aggression or the violation by the White House of the Constitution, federal statutes, international treaties. There used to be hearings by Senator Fulbright on the Vietnam War, which helped end that war. The House Foreign Relations Committee has got to work on that. Criminal justice reform, that one is long overdue. I mean, the Congress is the main investigative branch of the U.S. government, and it's been asleep while the Republicans have been cashing in with these corporate cash contributions. How about climate devastation? I think we shouldn't use the words climate change. It's too benign. When I was growing up in New England, climate change meant summer, autumn, winter, and spring. We're talking climate crisis, climate devastation. Been no hearings on that, a major threat to the planet and to the natural world. So you can just go list after list. Minimum wage, that should be up right away. That's a frozen $7.25. 30 million Americans are making less today than workers made in 1968, adjusted for inflation.
Ralph,
and that's got to be the House Labor Committee.
I want to go further with this issue in our next segment, but I wanted to talk about these latest developments and get your response, for example, to Trump tapping Mick Mulvaney to become the acting chief of staff to replace General John Kelly. Mulvaney already holding 2 posts in the administration. He's White House budget director and acting director of something I think you care a lot about, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Mulvaney's promotion came as the Daily Beast website obtained a video recorded in 2016 of then Congressperson Mick Mulvaney in a congressional debate calling Donald Trump a terrible human being. This is what he said.
Yes, I'm supporting Donald Trump. I'm doing so as enthusiastically as I can, given the fact I think he's a terrible human being. But the choice on the other side is just as bad.
So there he's calling Trump a terrible human being. Talk about the role that Mulvaney has played and what's going on in the White House right now. And does it matter who is chief of staff? And is it significant that he has been approved by the Senate in his current roles? And so that could mean he could be subpoenaed by the Senate and testify in a way that an advisor that wasn't approved might not be able to be.
Well, it's been called the second most important job in the federal government, chief of staff to the president. Mulvaney is a massive outlaw. He has, everywhere he goes in the federal government, he shuts down law enforcement. He harasses civil servants. He aids and abets Wall Street crimes with his supervision of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. He's basically said one of the main purposes of this agency is to protect Wall Street, when it's just the opposite. It was to bring them to justice when they commit these crimes, these deceptions, these manipulations with other people's money, pension money, mutual fund money. So he really is an outlaw. And unfortunately, our legal system doesn't give ready access to the courts by citizens to sue to remove him from office. He can be removed by the president, but let no one be puzzled when he starts applying with another outlaw, John Bolton, the national security advisor to Donald Trump, to foreign and military policy. These people are really clinically outlaws. They don't believe in the constitutional power of Congress to declare war. They don't believe in the Constitution of Congress to confirm nominees that are in important offices, major offices, as the principal officers, as the Constitution provides. They've never met a war they haven't liked. More and more weapon systems. They fought against the auditing of the Pentagon budget, something conservatives say is obvious. Runaway corruption in corporate contracting, Lockheed Martin's F-35. So I think President Trump is digging himself an even bigger hole by putting Mulvaney there. The combination of Mulvaney, John Bolton, and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is a lethal one even for Trump's political survival. He's trying to get sycophants around him, which is usually a late stage in the collapse of a regime.
So on Saturday, President Trump also announced that Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke will soon resign. I think he was given an ultimatum of something like by the end of the year. Zinke facing at least 17 federal investigations into suspected ethics violations. During his time in office, Zinke presided over the largest rollback of protections to federal land in U.S. history, opened up vast swaths of U.S. coastal waters to oil and gas drilling, very much following in the model, I think, of Scott Pruitt, the former EPA head, who is then replaced by Andrew Wheeler, the acting EPA head, who is a coal lobbyist. It looks like Zinke's being replaced by the acting, by his deputy, also an oil and gas lobbyist.
Well, that's what was foreseen by a full-page ad over a year ago by dozens of companies that are in the outdoor recreation business, led by Patagonia and their CEO, Yvon Chouinard. They basically predicted this is exactly what Zinke was going to do. He was going to try to overturn existing statutes and regulations by fiat, and he's in court. Environmental groups have taken him to court many times. So it's a good event that he is now out of office, and Mr. Trump has to start all over again in terms of trying to corporatize the resources that are on our federal lands that are owned by the American people and trust for posterity.
In this possible government shutdown that could take place right before the Christmas holidays on Friday, Trump wanting something like, he's saying $5 billion for the border wall. You see his shutdown showdown with Pelosi and Schumer in the Oval Office.
Well, as usual, the Democrats don't use all the arguments they have. What Schumer and Pelosi should have said in that White House confrontation, that was televised was, Mr. President, if you shut down the federal government, you're going to cost far more American lives than a porous wall that is eroding farmer property values and ranchers on the Mexican border, because the shutdown will involve about 800,000 workers. Look where these workers are coming from. Homeland Security. He's going to shut down Homeland Security to build the porous wall for so-called border security. How about this? The law enforcement officials would be furloughed in terms of undermining public safety. How about the environmental protection dealing with toxic air, water pollution? How about people in the Food and Drug Administration supposed to be looking out for food safety, recalls of contaminated food? The Democrats don't know how to make strong arguments, whether it's for single payer, cracking down on corporate crime. They really have to wake up. I'm going to hold them, and I think a lot of citizen groups are going to hold them to high expectations in the House of Representatives. There's huge corruption in the executive branch. You have poll after poll in America, and that it comes in number one. What most people are concerned about is political corruption, because they know how it plays out in their daily lives. They've got to have, through the House Oversight Committee, prime hearings on political corruption in the Trump administration, some of which is inherited from prior administrations.
And your thoughts on impeachment?
Well, impeachment is going to await the report of the Mueller investigation. If he comes out with documentation in terms of high crimes and misdemeanor potential, the House of Representatives has a constitutional obligation to initiate impeachment hearings. I mean, it's just basically investigating the high crimes and misdemeanors of President Trump and other high officials. We shouldn't make a big deal out of it. I mean, our founding fathers let presidents between elections be unaccountable except for one measure, and that is the impeachment function. And basically, they said, look, we're going to let Congress fire a high government official if they impeach in the House and convict in the Senate. There's a good book on impeachment that educates people that has come out recently, and there are other information sources. I mean, people have got to stop thinking that impeachment is like the ultimate neutron bomb or something. It should be viewed as a normal way. We're the smallest but most powerful under the Constitution branch of government. The only really way they can have to hold the executive branch accountable person by person, official by official. So Congressman Jerry Nadler, who's heading the House Judiciary Committee, has got to look at his constitutional duties here.
Ralph, I'd like to ask you to stay with us as we talk about your book. Ralph Nader, longtime consumer advocate, corporate critic, former presidential candidate, has just written a new book, which we're going to talk about in a moment, To the Ramparts, How Bush and Obama Paved the Way for the Trump Presidency and Why It Isn't Too Late to Reverse Course. Stay with us. Land of a Thousand advances by the Midnighters. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. In January, Democrats will take control of the House with a record number of women, more than 100, headed to Congress. Among them, many new progressive members, including Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York, along with Ilhan Omar in Minnesota and Rashida Tlaib of Michigan, the first two Muslim women ever elected to Congress. Tlaib, born in Detroit to Palestinian immigrant parents. She'll wear a traditional Palestinian dress when she's sworn into Congress in January, also planning to lead a congressional delegation on a tour of the Israeli-occupied West Bank, an alternative to the biannual tours led by AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, for freshman members of Congress. And two Native American women elected for the first time to Congress as well. The progressive bloc. Already, the congressional progressives have the largest caucus. Now it will be even larger. The question is what they will do with it. Still with us, Ralph Nader, longtime consumer advocate, former presidential candidate. He's just written the book To the Ramparts, How Bush and Obama Paved the Way for the Trump Presidency and Why It Isn't Too Late to Reverse Course. Can you talk about the mandate you see Congress has right now and what you feel, Ralph Nader, they should do about it?
Well, just generally speaking, Amy, the mandate is to enforce the law and obey the Constitution. It sounds cliche-ish, but look at the voter repression that's going on all over the country, which, if it wasn't applying, might have produced even more progressive representatives in the House and the Senate. That's got to be looked into. Look at the enormous waste of shareholder money in stock buybacks. Apple is buying back $100 billion of its stock this year. That is like 200 years a budget for OSHA, protecting the health and safety of American workers. It's dozens of years of Centers for Disease Control budget. And Apple doesn't know anything better to do with $100 billion, like shoring up pension funds, like dealing with recycling the terrifically toxic waste from its used computers around the globe. That would take $2 billion out of $100 billion. Like investing more in research and development or giving it back to Apple shareholders. So this whole stock buyback is a stripping of shareholder rights, including pension funds and mutual funds. It's a stripping of shareholder power and a huge waste of money. It isn't like this country doesn't need investment. It's like these corporations, they want all these tax breaks to get capital for investment. They told Congress, and no one in the Democratic Party said, really? How come in the last 10 years you burned $7 trillion of stock buybacks to enhance the metrics for your executive compensation, which is out of control? So we've got to network all of these structures of abuses of power, from the White House to Wall Street, right down to states like North Carolina or Wisconsin, where they are detonating the critical right of voting in this country and reaping the dividends for their corporate paymasters. So I think it's time really to get down to the nitty-gritty, which is it's all about Congress to turn around the executive branch, judicial branch. It's 535 people. We know their names. They put their shoes on like we do every morning. And we know that they want something we can give them or deny. It's called votes. People say, well, it's all about campaign money. They want campaign money to intimidate their opponents and to put ads on TV to get votes. We cut the campaign money off like the pass, like the Khyber Pass. You cut it off right by mobilizing Congress watchdog groups in every congressional district. Now, here's where people start getting bored, when you start thinking of how you can turn this around. There are 725,000 people, men, women, children, each congressional district. A mere 0.5% of the adults, say a little over 1 million people, organized in 435 districts with full-time offices, representing left-right changes in our country. A huge left-right support down where people live, work, and raise their family. They may call themselves conservative or call themselves liberals, but they want the same things. They want safe medicines. They want access to health care that's affordable. They want better schools. They want repaired public services, sewage, drinking water, highways, bridges. They want clean politics. That's what the Democratic Party has for an opportunity now, is to appeal to left-right collective action, which comes out of the grassroots, and it's unbeatable politically in Congress. So I put this book out on the ramparts in order to show how to turn it around. You turn it around by focusing individually on your 2 senators and representatives. And to make it more joyous, this companion book called How the Rats Reformed the Congress. You can get it by going to ratsreformcongress.org, and you will get a whole printout on the technical ways, the civic ways to build these Congress watchdog groups so they become heard on Capitol Hill, which includes the citizen summons of your 2 senators and representatives that's in this book, to summon them to your town meetings, to your agendas, to all the things that are off the table by the Democrats and the Republicans. That's not that hard to do. People do much more difficult things in their daily lives. How about raising children? How about dealing with health care problems? How about trying to take care in a coarse health care system, an ailing grandparent? How about trying to recover from accidents? How about trying to make ends meet, a single mom and daycare? They do a lot more difficult things, and they're going to continue to have to do difficult things if they don't have a certain amount of their time to mobilize these Congress watchdog groups.
I wanted to ask you, Ralph, recently long-serving Congressmember John Lewis joined other lawmakers in supporting the incoming New York Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's call for a Green New Deal. Lewis, the highest-profile Congressmember so far to back Ocasio-Cortez's resolution to create a bipartisan committee that would work on a plan to bring the U.S. to a carbon-neutral economy and adopt 100% renewable energy. The proposal for the committee also seeks to bar lawmakers who've accepted money from the fossil fuel industry. Other lawmakers who support the Green New Deal include Independent Senator Bernie Sanders. I recently spoke with him about it.
A Green New Deal is creating many millions of decent-paying jobs, transforming our energy system away from fossil fuel to energy efficiency and sustainable energy.
So, Ralph Nader, what about the significance of this as we've just returned from Poland from the UN climate summit there?
Well, it's obvious. I mean, it's basically revving up the people's economy and telling the corporate economy they have to reset and they have to adjust. Otherwise, they're going to be displaced locally by waves of energy efficiency, renovating buildings, public buildings, homes, good jobs, as Bernie Sanders said, that can't be exported abroad in every community, less pollution, less global warming, more money in people's pockets because a green economy is much more efficient. They become much more self-reliant. Solar panels on more homes instead of going to your fossil fuel vendor. So, I mean, it goes without saying, but you see, Congress got to have these hearings. They've got to make this a high visibility issue. And that's what we've been lacking for years now. Congress has been a dead zone. It's been wasting $5 billion, which is its budget, and increasing congressional secrecy, restrictive rules on progressive members, and putting more and more power in the hands of the top leaders, stripping even the formerly committee chairs of the ability to decide for themselves what kind of hearings. How did we get auto safety in the 1960s? It was hearings in Congress that aroused the people, led to recall of cars, pushed Lyndon Johnson to support it with Joe Califano. Almost all the changes in our country start at the federal level with Congress or state legislatures. I mean, people say, oh, we got to go to court. But the court relies on certain statutory rights that are invoked. Oh, we got to change the EPA and get it going. But if it doesn't have an adequate budget, if it doesn't have adequate authority, what kind of quality of staff are going to stay there? It goes back to Congress, 535 people.
Ralph, your book, To the Ramparts, its subtitle, How Bush and Obama Paved the Way for the Trump Presidency and Why It Isn't Too Late to Reverse Course. Very briefly summarize this.
Yeah, I'll do it very briefly. Donald Trump wanted to be president when he was in his 30s. That was his dream. Yeah, he's, very, very ambitious, very, very egocentric. So he's sitting here watching a lot of TV, and he sees all the trouble Clinton got into with infidelities, mistreating women, covering up, even being convicted of perjury in a court case, losing his law license in Arkansas. And Donald Trump says, I see, that's one more barrier that falls that he can get away with. And then he's watching George W. Bush driving health and safety regulation to ground, coddling Wall Street, wars of aggression, sort of a presidency of immense concentrated power, regardless of the Constitution or other legal restraints. And he says, hey, that's another thing I don't have to worry about. I can get away with. I like to use power. And then along comes Obama. Obama doesn't prosecute anybody on Wall Street. He takes more money from Wall Street than John McCain. He sells $60 billion of armaments to the Saudis and more armaments to the Israelis, and says, well, that's because of Iran, and it creates jobs in our country. That's Barack Obama. And Trump is looking at this on TV and say, this is I can get away with that too. I mean, it was all laid out for them. And why should we be surprised? Although the Electoral College selected Donald Trump, he didn't win the popular vote, but he came close enough to invoke that antiquated mechanism. So we shouldn't just think that replacing Donald Trump, whether by resignation or impeachment or defeat in 2020, is going to change the fundamental corrupt, corporatist, war-making structure of our federal government. The abuse of public budgets, taking people's tax money instead of returning it to them in terms of public works and infrastructure and other services, giving it to Wall Street or getting it drained away by corporate tax loopholes. Pretty soon these corporations are going to be tax-exempt, profitable institutions the way they're going. So that's why I wrote this book. So we don't get too complacent with a few progressive members of Congress and the so-called blue wave. The Democrats have got a lot to account for before they are replaced by progressive Democrats.
Finally, you mentioned Yemen, and we're going to talk about that in our next segment with our guest. But in a historic vote, the U.S. Senate passed this resolution Thursday calling for an end to U.S. military and financial support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen, representing the first time in U.S. history the Senate's voted to withdraw military forces from an unauthorized war using the War Powers Resolution. The measure passed 56-41. Earlier this year, you wrote a letter to the president. You wrote a letter directly to President Trump saying, by any standard of international law, you're a knowing aider and abetter of these war crimes at a level of complicity that approximates being a backroom partner in the broad range of military operations against millions of innocent Yemeni families. And you wrote that before the Khashoggi murder in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul on October 2nd. As we move into this next segment on Yemen, if you could finally comment on the significance of this vote, Republicans joining with Democrats.
Very significant. In fact, a former Reagan Deputy Attorney General, Bruce Fein, drafted that resolution, working with Senator Mike Lee. This is what I mean. Once you get an increasing convergence between Republicans and Democrats on issue 1, issue 2, issue 3, things start changing. Now, this resolution, it can be vetoed. It's probably not going to go anywhere. But in the new Congress, there's got to be vigorous public hearings about the atrocities in Yemen. 8 million people on the verge of starvation, as you've pointed out in many programs, unfortunately ignored by the national TV news network business. Cholera, over 1 million cholera cases. The world has never recorded that many cholera cases. The bombings by Saudi airmen trained in the U.S. using U.S. equipment. They're bombing water wells and hospitals and schools. Consider that magazine article in yesterday's New York Times. This is heart-rending. description of criminality here. I think Trump can clearly be indicted if we belong to the International Criminal Court as a war criminal. He's openly abetting these kinds of atrocities with U.S. tax dollars, U.S. equipment, U.S. diplomatic cover, and he knows exactly. He sees the pictures of the slaughter of innocent men, women, children in Yemen, a poor country of 27 million people on the verge of national starvation. When was the last time we saw something like that connected right to the Oval Office? Donald Trump, look yourself in the mirror. If you don't like the looks of a war criminal, stop the war in Yemen now.
Ralph Nader, I want to thank you so much for being with us. Longtime consumer advocate, corporate critic, former presidential candidate. His most recent book, To the Ramparts, How Bush and Obama Paved the Way for the Trump Presidency and Why It Isn't Too Late to Reverse Course. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we look at a bomb made by Raytheon in Tucson, Arizona, and how it made its way to Yemen. The number of people it killed, who died, who was maimed. Stay with us.
What I shame, what I miss, is others mess. They've lost themselves. Come, look at them. Come and see them crawling to satisfy their vanity. So you say now modern times have gone, that no human must be left behind, that all should rush forward with tire, life for sale, debauchery, no dignity, I say. Free tickets to hell, don't have to pay. Beware, my bro, not to break your legs on this bed. What a shame, what a shame, what a shame,
What a shame by Salmood here on Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. In a historic vote, the U.S. Senate passed a resolution Thursday calling for an end to U.S. military and financial support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen. This represents the first time in U.S. history the Senate's voted to withdraw military forces from an unauthorized war using the War Powers Act. The vote, 56-41. But the bill is not expected to pass the House, at least this year. The vote came as peace talks in Sweden result in a ceasefire in the strategic port city of Hodeidah that's scheduled to go into effect at midnight. The Saudi-led war in Yemen's created what the UN calls the world's worst humanitarian crisis, with more than half of Yemen's 28 million people on the brink of famine. A recent report by Save the Children estimates 85,000 children under the age of 5 have died from acute malnutrition brought on by the war. We end today's show looking at a remarkable piece in this week's New York Times Magazine. It's headlined From Arizona to Yemen, the journey of an American bomb. When a bomb like this explodes, it doesn't just kill people, it rearranges them. The article traces how bombs built by Raytheon in Tucson, Arizona, made its way into the Saudi arsenal and then were dropped on Yemeni villages. The article centers on what happened in the remote village of Ahab, when U.S.-backed Saudi warplanes carried out a series of bombings September 10, 2016. 2 months before the 2016 election. Barack Obama still president. According to Human Rights Watch, at least 31 civilians were killed, 3 of them children, 42 people injured. Remnants of the U.S.-made bombs were found at the site of the attack. We're joined now by the journalist who wrote the piece, Jeffrey Stern. He wrote this in partnership with the Pulitzer Center, author of several books, including The Last 1,001 Schools Promise in a Nation at War. Jeff Stern, welcome to Democracy Now! Lay out what you found. Tell us where this community in Yemen is and what happened to them on that fateful day in September of 2016.
Hi, well, it's good to be with you. Yeah, so this was a district with a few villages. People had come together to build a well for themselves. This was a little bit into the blockade. It was a little bit into the food shortage, and frankly, they needed more water and they needed their crops to grow more. It's a very dry area. It's a volcanic area in northern Yemen, and so people had pooled their resources to try to dig a well. And that's pretty expensive. These are mostly subsistence farmers, so it was not easy to come up with this kind of capital, but they pooled their resources, they built a well, and on the day that the drill struck water, the planes came. And first it was early in the morning, and a bomb fell and killed about 6 people and injured more. And then about 5 or 6 hours later, once people had gathered to look for loved ones, to help, to just see what was going on, the planes came back and they stayed for several hours chasing people down and dropping bombs on them.
And explain who they were. I mean, this is a beautifully written piece as well. You actually, Jeff, went there. You went to Yemen, and you went to this community and met the survivors. Tell us who some of them are, who died, who survived.
Yeah, I mean, there was a man who owned he was a small business owner, really. He owned a drill rig, and he was known as a pretty charitable man who would often forgive debts because often people couldn't afford to pay for a well, and you could dig and not find anything, and it still cost tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. He was killed. There was a young judge who had been working in traffic court, actually, who was essentially burned alive. There were also a lot of people who survived, and one of the things that we were able to do, the magazine was able to make space for, is to describe what it's like to try to get treatment for these incredibly traumatic injuries in an incredibly poor country that also is suffering from a blockade. So fairly basic medical supplies are just unavailable. So, even the people that survived had incredibly tough roads to recovery, and frankly, some of them will never recover. Even those who will remain alive now can't farm. They can't use their bodies. It's hard to get prosthetics. It's hard to get treatment. So the effect of these bombs that are designed to create to create casualties in as wide an area as possible on people who are really unable to get fairly basic medical care, it's really devastating.
If you could talk about the connection of this bombing, a Saudi air attack that dropped a U.S. bomb on Yemen back 2 years ago, to the cholera epidemic, the worst in the world.
Right. Well, and that's one of the reasons why we chose to focus on this strike. Now, of course, taking one water well offline doesn't create a cholera epidemic, but the aggregate effect of hitting so much critical infrastructure, including water wells, including water treatment facilities. The other thing that I think is really critical that is a little bit overlooked and that I actually hadn't even thought of until someone mentioned this when I was there, was that if you pool your resources and do something for your community, like dig a well or build a water treatment facility, and this is what happens, you kind of learn your lesson. I mean, you learn that to build a water well for yourself, to build a water sanitation treatment for your community, to build a factory, you're inviting the planes to come. You're inviting this kind of incredible devastation on yourself. And people were terrified and traumatized, and frankly, basically stopped doing this kind of thing, stopped building wells. So, in the aggregate, what happened is the number of people in acute need of water spiked right around that time. About 3 weeks after this well was hit, the first cases of cholera were reported, and of course, within a year, there were 1 million suspected cases, and it was one of the worst cases of one of the worst outbreaks of cholera in recorded history.
And the U.S. military saying, give us their explanation for what they did and why they would strike a community that was trying to put in a well.
Well, so the U.S. military is not doing the bombing. The U.S. military has stopped refueling. For a while, they were doing aerial refueling for the Saudi military, for the Saudi-backed coalition, which is important because that allows for something called dynamic targeting, which is when the planes go up and they look for things to hit. Essentially, they don't have to necessarily depend on intelligence and plan strikes in advance. So when you're able to loiter, you can look for things to hit. And at the time, the U.S. was providing the refueling, which we have since stopped. The explanation that the Saudi-backed coalition, they have something called a Joint Incident, the JIAT, which ostensibly investigates some of these strikes and recommends action. They eventually investigated this, came out with a very brief statement that said, in essence, that the water digger looked like it could be a ballistic missile launcher. That the explanation, kind of strains credulity. They don't look that much alike a water drill or a ballistic missile launcher. They're also, if you hit a ballistic missile launcher, there'd be secondary explosions. There's fuel, and the planes came back and chased people down for several hours.
And a double tap, as you put it, one hit after another. So people of concern who are concerned in the community coming to save those who've been hit the first time, then they get killed.
Exactly, and especially children. I mean, this is a place where not a lot happens, and kids were curious, and people ran out of their houses once the sun came up and started to gather there. And also, in this case, double tap doesn't quite do it justice. Human Rights Watch, Priyanka Modaparthi, a researcher for Human Rights Watch, showed up within several weeks of this attack, and she found 12 craters. The people said it felt like more than 20 bombs had fallen. Of course, we don't know that. We know that at least 12 fell. So it's a double tap, kind of, but really it's one explosion that drew people out, and then at least 12 more.
And then talk about the bomb. Talk about going to Tucson. Talk about the company that made the bomb.
So, that was a sort of interesting and kind of a heart-wrenching aspect of this, even after being in Yemen, is that some of the people I talked to at Raytheon really are building. They take pride in what they do. Now, this is not scientific. I did not poll thousands of workers. I talked to two who we kept anonymous, but they are building not bombs, but the precision guidance systems that are attached to bombs. So what they're doing, what they believe they're doing, is taking something that would create a lot of collateral damage and allowing it to create minimal collateral damage. And theoretically, right, that's true. I mean, if used correctly, then supposedly, you would use a bomb like this, and you could hit what you want to hit and avoid hitting what you don't want to hit. The other thing is they talked about how much pride they take in helping the American warfighter, in keeping the American warfighter safe. And actually in keeping themselves safe. Raytheon is a leader in workplace safety, and I guess somewhat ironically. In this case, though, when in the case of foreign sales, we are providing these weapons sometimes to allies that are using them not as they're designed to be used, and perhaps in exactly the opposite way of how they were designed to use. So the idea of using a very precise weapon to minimize civilian casualties only works if you're trying to minimize civilian casualties. And I won't go as far as saying that the Saudi-backed coalition are deliberately causing a humanitarian catastrophe. I don't think that's something that certainly I can know. But at very least, they've been extraordinarily careless, and using these weapons to hit things like water wells, whether they believe it's a water well or not, has created the world's worst humanitarian catastrophe.
And finally, Saudi Arabia going to the State Department through foreign military sales, FMS. We have just 15 seconds.
Yeah, I mean, we do this with a lot of different countries. The Pentagon works as sort of a broker and helps foreign countries get what they need. And, often those countries are serving our interests, or at least we believe they do. The State Department rigorously investigates, provides oversight, I should say, to these sales. But we are facilitating this. I mean, we are taking weapons from private contractors and putting them in the hands of the Saudi-backed coalition, which is bombing civilians.
Jeffrey Steinweiner, thank you very much for being with us. Jeffrey Stern's latest piece for The New York Times, we will link to From Arizona to Yemen, The Journey of an American Bomb. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.